So recently I took a trip to Singapore. Thought I'd take a few minutes to tell you how that trip turned out. It began on the 24th of April when Jay Lee, pastor at Orlando Korean Presbyterian Church, called me up and asked if I'd be willing to go on a vision trip with him and his assistant Terrence Ng to Singapore. Terrence is from Singapore and he wants to go back there, take over a church as the pastor, and with a friend who is the pastor of another church, work on planting another church, and then eventually a presbytery, and eventually a Reformed Presbyterian denomination in the South Pacific. And since that's completely consistent with our vision to be an epicenter church, to be a church that just doesn't affect the local community, but wherever God might have us be used, and our church is pretty healthy, I thought that was a pretty good idea, so I said, yeah, I'd be glad to go. So they made all the arrangements. We would be traveling over 10,000 miles, literally halfway around the world. And so they took care of all the travel arrangements. I just had to make sure that I had my suitcase and a passport. So the first thing I needed to do was actually go and get a passport replaced. I thought I had an out-of-date passport, the only one I had in my stuff at home. And so I managed to make my appointment. I got there. I went through the whole process and then found out from the customs clerk that I actually had an up-to-date passport. So apparently I had lost it, so they needed to give me a replacement passport. But one dad joke later and a quick prayer of asking God to work things smoothly, and the processing officer finished all the paperwork with a smile, and 1 week later, I had my passport. Singapore, here we come. So next I decided to do some research, and I'll share with you a bit of a summary of what I found out about the amazing country of Singapore. It was founded in 1299 by an Indonesian prince named Sang Nila Utama. He thought he saw a lion on the island when he first visited. There was nothing there, just wild island, and so he named it Singapura. That's from the Sanskrit language, and it means lion city. And so you can appreciate how they have adopted something called the mer lion. That's a half lion, half fish, kind of like a mermaid or a merman or ta-da, Aquaman. But no, Singapore is a island city-state. It's got 120 miles of coastline. They actually export 25% of all ornamental fish sold in the world. That would be the fish that we keep in our aquarium. So they use a merlion as a symbol for their nation. The main island is about 31 miles across by 17 miles deep. There's a total of 64 islands in the area, and the whole landmass is about 2/3 the size of New York City, so it's not that large. It is one of 3 remaining city-states in the world, Monaco and the Vatican City being the other 2. It's a republic that was established in 1965 with their neighbors being Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, Laos, Vietnam, and the Philippines. 50% of these islands are covered with vegetation. Even the main city is just a beautiful mixture of architecture and greenery. It's home to the flying fox. And now this isn't a fox that jumps around from trees to trees. It's a bat with a 5-foot wingspan. Don't worry, it likes to eat fruit, supposedly. The Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, that contains more tree species than the entire North American continent. And then in 2015, Singapore Botanical Gardens was named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, and indeed, the whole city is just gorgeous. It is the 3rd largest financial hub city in the world, following New York and London. It's one of the East Asian tigers. These are 4 nations, the other 3, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. In the late 20th century and on into the 21st century, their economies, their free market economies, are booming so great that they've been called the East Asian tigers. 80% of the citizens of Singapore own a cell phone. Many of them own 2 cell phones, one for business use and personal use. And then 90% of them live in public housing. We'll talk about that a little more later. There are many different ethnicities, but there are 3 main ones. Chinese, 76%, Malay, 15%, and Indian, 7%. There are many different languages spoken, but there are 4 official ones. Mandarin is supposedly 36% of the population. Now, English is supposedly 32%, but since they teach English in the primary schools, my guess is that that probably is actually higher. There's probably many people who are more speaking English, but they are just not native English speakers. Malay is 12%. Other Chinese languages other than Mandarin are 14%. And different Indian languages are 4%. Religions. This is a tremendous melting pot of major world religions. Buddhism is 33%. Christian is 19%. Islam is 14%. Taoism, which is Chinese, is 11%. And then Hinduism, which is from India, is 5%. And here's a picture of one of the mosques. There are mosques all over the city. Absolutely gorgeous in their architecture. But remember, this is a synagogue of Satan. Their architecture throughout the whole city is amazing. They've got a big downtown area that they've built up called Suntec City. It's made up of 5 main towers. 4 of them are about 40 stories tall. One's about 20 stories tall. They're arranged in the shape of a hand. Remember, Chinese culture is influencing the city dramatically, and they've arranged it in this shape because it's good feng shui. This is good luck, if you will, from the forces of nature. Changi Airport that we landed at is amazing in its architecture. They have one of the most interesting things I ever heard of. They house a rain vortex. It's a man-made waterfall. It's indoors, and it is 131 feet in height. The water literally drops through the ceiling down. Here you actually have a picture of it with laser lights being shined onto it. Fascinating. That's not the only one. Their national stadium, they have a retractable roof. Now, that's not unusual to have a roof over your stadium, but to have a retractable is kind of neat. But even more than that, they actually can project on it. So you could be sitting in the stadium and watching a sporting event or some other event and look up and watch the whole thing being played on the roof itself. Some of you have heard of the Singapore Sling. It's a mixed drink. It was first served in Singapore in 1915. Crime rates in this nation are very, very low, among the lowest in the world. They still use caning. That is whipping across the backside with a rattan stick, like you see right here. They use that for 35 different offenses. They're a world leader in the number of death sentences meted out primarily for drug dealers. And at the end of the day, what can we say about these things? Singapore is a very clean city. It is marked by politeness and respect towards one another, and there is an intense desire on the part of all the citizens to protect their way of life. So on to the trip. On the 14th, early in the morning, 5:30, Graham got up with me. We were both really tired, got in the car, drove to the airport, got to the airport, picked up an hour because of the time zone change, got into that long line for security. Things are pretty good at the Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport now, moved pretty rapidly, no problems. Got on my airplane at 10:30 and headed for Orlando and arrived in Orlando at about 1 o'clock. Now, our flight didn't leave until about 6:30, and I still needed to meet up with Terrence and Jay. Here's a picture of Terrence and his wife Grace and their 2 daughters, Adele and Beatrice. And again, they're getting ready to move back, Lord willing, by the end of the year to Singapore and take over a church. That was one of the purposes of the trip. So Jay and myself and Terrence, as I said, we were supposed to meet there. And it's kind of neat. Terrence, a recent graduate, he's got to pay attention now to transition and moving his family back to their home country of Singapore. So I had a check-in bag for my ticket. That was part of my ticket that I wasn't using. I had a carry-on bag. And so Terrence needed to use that check-in bag to ship home some books. So I went out through the airport outside of security and met him, and he checked in 3 large suitcases, each full of books weighing about 50 pounds. And he still has a lot more before he gets his seminary library shipped back home. So that meant we had to get back in and go through security at Orlando International. So Jay and I were in line there. Terrence was on the phone and found out that he had a problem with his visa. This was the first of the potential problems in a mission trip. These things happen on a regular basis. It turns out that his school, RTS Orlando, has a new dean of students, and the U.S. State Department allows the dean of students to sign off on the application for a student visa, and that apparently has to be updated every year. Well, the new Dean of Students signed off on Terrence's, and then he found out at the last minute that the new Dean of Students hadn't been actually verified by the State Department, so they didn't accept it as a valid request. So they had to go through the process of updating the State Department records and then getting a new visa for Terrence. The problem is if Terrence had traveled with this, he could have left the country, but he wouldn't have been able to get back into the country without more paperwork and hassle. So the plan at this point was for Jay and I to get on the airplane if we needed to without Terrence, and Terrence to take a later flight. But God blessed. And Terrence came back through security, met us, and at 6:30 we boarded the airplane at Orlando. We stopped and picked up another airplane in Atlanta. No, I couldn't meet him there in the first place. Had to go through Orlando in order to get the flight set up, because it's a one flight, even though it's multiple stops, all the way to Singapore. And by the time we had landed at 6:30 Pacific Standard Time, we had been traveling, or I should say I had been traveling for 16 hours. You can imagine I was tired. First thing we had to do when we got in San Francisco, surprisingly enough, is had to go back through a TSA security checkpoint process. Because we're traveling international, we had to go through another process. Now, this is interesting. They have this broken down into a two-part process. First, we went through this gate here where they just checked our ticket and our passport, made sure who we are. We were good to go. And then we got to enter into the terminal, but we went to the international terminal, and the whole area, literally, it has the walkway, it has these traveling sidewalks, then it has some chairs sitting outside of your gate, and giant metal glass walls between you and the actual gate. And then about 2 to 3 hours before the flight is ready to leave, they open the gate, and you have to actually go through the TSA, take off your shoes, throw everything in the bucket, do the pat-down process. I'm not sure if it's more efficient or not. I do know it's the first time I've traveled internationally since the TSA process has been there. It was quite interesting, but we got through everything pretty easily. And we got on that Boeing 787 Dreamliner. We're heading for a 17-hour flight over the Pacific from San Francisco to the Lion City. Now, what would you do if you were going to be 17 hours over an ocean flying? How would you pass the time, especially when you're already very tired and everyone around you is making all sorts of noise, and it's almost impossible to sit in these tiny little seats and, you know, the tiny little legroom? Well, thank goodness they gave us lots of movies to watch. I watched 5 or 6 dumb movies. It was hard picking ones that were appropriate to watch. That's normal in our culture, but managed to find 5 or 6 interesting stories, but got bored after like the second one, and yet at the same time was just grateful that I had something to distract me because I really couldn't sleep. We finally landed at 9:30 Singapore Standard Time. We had crossed the date line, so I'd actually picked up a day, left on the 14th, arrived on the 16th at Changi International Airport. It's very interesting. Singapore's immigration process, they've got it very, very efficient. We arrived at Terminal 1 for the arrival, got in line, and went through pretty quickly. I'll tell you, I did not tell this immigration officer a dad joke. The look on his face of the seriousness and the scowl, I decided I didn't want to antagonize him if I gave him a stupid one, and he wasn't interested in groaning. Especially when they warn you just as you're coming in, they're very serious about all their laws. But we got through, we got picked up by a couple of the elders of the church, and we got taken to our hotel at 10:30 Thursday morning, the 16th of May. I'd been in the air traveling for, I should say, from my front door to the hotel, 34 hours. We got to the rendezvous hotel, managed to go upstairs at about 11:30, get a room, managed to lay down for an hour or so, and then got prepared for a meeting that we're having at 2 o'clock with Ten Huaizi, the pastor of One Covenant Church. This is Terrence's friend. As Terrence was coming to America to go to seminary, Tan was coming back from a Presbyterian seminary in Australia, and they agreed that Tan would work to start a church, and then Terrence would come back and, at the time, start another church, and together they would talk about starting up a presbytery. But God is a little changed. We'll tell you about that in a minute. So here's a picture of Tan, and then a picture of him during one of his worship services. He's preaching to his congregation. We met until about 3:30, and then it was time for lunch/dinner, and we went down the street, and a fellow named I'm Kim decided to help us out at a Korean barbecue. We have these here in Gumptown. I encourage you to try them out. This is where you can sit down, and they've got 10 different meats and 20 different vegetables, and you pile all this fresh stuff on your plates, bring it back to your table. You're having conversations with your table mates and grilling your food. It's all very, very good. Thoroughly enjoyed the meal, but I was exhausted. And so by 5:30, I had a rendezvous with the bed in my hotel room, and boy, was I so glad. Now, jet lag, I really didn't suffer too much, but I only slept at that point until about 12:30 and woke up. If you realize that we're about 11 hours distance, you realize that, I woke up kind of midday if I was back here in America, and I can't go back to sleep. So I read a little of this, and I did a little of that, and then got up in the morning, and by 8 o'clock, we went for breakfast. We went to a traditional hawker center. These are basically like an open-air cafeteria with food stalls. You could see these lying up on either side. This is where Terrence's parents live nearby, and they eat here almost every morning. Terrence has had a lot of breakfasts here as well. And so here's where we got our breakfast. Tong Ho coffee stall, absolutely gorgeous coffee. And then the Sun Ki Wonton Mi. Can you guess what I ate for breakfast? That's right, wonton soup with noodles, sliced pork, and some jalapenos, and some other little things on the side that I had no idea what they were. Interesting breakfast. It was good. It was okay. And here we are meeting Terrence's parents. It was a good time, and we had a little more time before we were going to have a meeting later that afternoon. And so Terrence next walked in the area a little bit with us, and he showed us some of the public housing. Now, this is the front side on the left, and then the back side on the right. And I want to just point out a few things. Notice you see some clothes hanging out there. If you look carefully, you'll see that that's kind of a metal T hanging out the side of the building. And that's like a clothesline. Literally, they hang clotheslines off of either end of the T, or they just hang their clothes off the center of the T and dry them. You might sit there and think, well, this is poor housing. And the answer is, well, if 90% of the people live in public housing, not necessarily. And look closely. Do you see trash anywhere? You don't. And as well as no trash anywhere, you don't see any graffiti or anything. Their public housing is very, very clean. And you can understand that if they catch you defacing the property in any way, they're going to give you a big fine, or they might even cane you. And so people are easily going to self-restrain themselves because the price to pay is just too high. And that means that the properties stay nice for everyone. So after our breakfast and looking at this for a little bit, we hopped in a cab and we drove down to Suntec City. This is that architectural location I mentioned to you downtown. Here are the Four Fingers. I couldn't get a picture with the thumb in it. And they have this giant fountain, the world's largest outdoor fountain there. And this is a picture of that and some of its beauty. And then here's one of the entrances to the mall that's associated with this. Is where the Civic Center is. They've got a giant mall attached to the Civic Center. This is a wall of, I don't know how many TVs. I haven't counted it, 60 to 100. Each of these is about 60-inch size TV. Absolutely amazing walking into the mall. The mall itself is 3 to 4 stories, and it's absolutely beautiful everywhere. The decor is just fantastic. There are hundreds of shops, and as we walked around and we were looking at things and getting ready a little later on that afternoon to go eat some lunch, Jay Lee posed a question to me. He asked me how I was doing. Now, I had been thinking something right before this, and so it was interesting. I wondered if he was talking about the same thing I'd just been thinking. I said, what do you mean, how am I doing? And he said, well, you're in a foreign country, and, if you look around, Reed, there's not many Anglos. Everyone speaks English, but you're a distinct minority, and there's not many Christians here as well. How do you feel? I thought that's a pretty interesting question, and that's actually what I was thinking about. I was thinking and looking and going, wow, I'm kind of a one of a kind here. This is pretty cool. So it was actually very interesting and very encouraging, traveling to a country that's dramatically different in its culture, and yet they speak the same language. We went to lunch at Penang Place. Now, Penang is actually the name of a Malaysian cuisine. Remember, Malaysia is the main nation nearby, and it's a primary Buddhist nation with a heavy-duty Muslim population. And so it's interesting. They've learned to cooperate with one another. Singapore got their freedom from Malaysia in 1965. So Terrence wanted to take us to this because this is one of the more popular cuisines. And it was a very good meal. And Terrence tested me out. He was a little worried about whether or not I could appreciate hot food. And with every single dish you receive a little side garnish of red chili peppers, all cut up and all fresh and all moist, a little bit of oil on it, and extremely hot. And I found that taking a little forkful of my main food and dipping it into chilies and then eating was absolutely delicious. So Terrence watched me, and he said I passed the heat test and I was good to go. He wasn't going to worry about anything I ate on the rest of the trip. And then as we were walking through, I was surprised, right in front of me, a Krispy Kreme donut store. Now, it wasn't morning, and I'm trying to watch my weight, so no more coffee and certainly no donut, but it is interesting. Wherever you go in the world, you're probably going to find a Starbucks, and you'll also find a Krispy Kreme. So we got done lunch, and it's probably about 2:30, and Terrence wants to show us a little bit more. And so he takes us to another interesting thing. In addition to the hawker centers, there's actually these open-air malls. Very similar to the Hawker Center open-air cafeteria. You walk into the mall. Here's the entrance to the Bugis Street one. It's a very famous one. You walk into the mall, and from the front to the back, you're just looking at two open sides. This is open air through the whole thing. There's no air conditioning. There's just fans blowing, and there's stalls no bigger than 10 by 10 on either side, and merchants are selling their things. And you look at the size of this crowd here. Yes, that was the size of the crowd that we were working our way through as we went to try and find gifts for our wives. And so then after that, we went to dinner at Din Tai Fung, a traditional Chinese dim sum restaurant. We were meeting with the elders and the deacons. Here's two of them. The picture didn't catch everyone. And right after dinner, we then got together and we went over to the Bible House. Now, the Bible House is a 4 or 5 story tall building built by the Bible League of Singapore, and then they rent out space to different Christian organizations, including churches. And so we met in one of the rooms that these folks rent, and we went over with them what it would be like for Open Kingdom Church Planting Network to help Terrence become the pastor of Providence Reformed Presbyterian Church. This is a church that was planted some time ago by the Bible Presbyterian denomination, and they're having some difficulties. And so this congregation was planted by a pastor about 5 years ago, and it was doing really, really well. And then surprisingly, after a few years, the founding pastor died. He just got sick and ill and died. And then they had a replacement pastor come in, but he wasn't prepared for what it meant to live in a foreign country for very long. And he and his family, they moved back to the States, where they're serving somewhere else right now. So they've been without a pastor for, I forget how long, maybe a year. And Pastor Terrence found out about this, and they said, well, maybe we should talk to you. And so he said, well, if you talk to me, I want to do this vision with my Open Kingdom Church Planting Network, and, they'll help me, and I need to get ordained. And they've never been a part of a presbytery. So for them, this was all new. They even asked this kind of question. Well, what happens a couple years from now if Terrence is doing well and we like it, the PCA decides they want to move him to a new church, as if we were Methodists or Anglicans. And now there is a very liberal Presbyterian denomination in Singapore. They have about 12 churches, and they do run this way, where pastors can be moved around without the authority of the local congregation. It's not really Presbyterian, in other words. They're very liberal in their doctrine as well. And so I sat there and heard all this, and I was kind of scratching my head, but let Terrence explain things and let Jay Lee explain things, and then added every now and then some observations. And pretty quickly they realized, wait a minute, you guys are just going to help us take the next step in being Presbyterian, and then you're going to help us reach our city and then reach our region of the world. Wow. So it helped alleviate their fears. Everything was good. And then we got done the meeting, and by 10 o'clock, I had sweated a lot that day, and I was feeling kind of crusty. Boy, did I need to find that shower and back in that bed. So this time I slept a little longer because we got to bed so late, and that was good. But I still woke up at about 3 or so, couldn't get back to sleep. And at about 8 o'clock that morning, we went across the street to a little combined building that had multiple vendors in it. And we went to the Toast Box and ordered a traditional breakfast. This is one of Terrence's favorites. It's just standard white bread toasted, and then there's something on it that looks like jelly. It is a sweet mixture. It's not jelly. And then that thing that looks like egg or cheese, I'm not really sure what that is. I couldn't really pin down the flavor of it, quite honestly. But then if you look at the eggs, these are actually what's called half-boiled eggs. Now, the example I got here for you is actually probably 3/4 boiled. The one I had was just a very thin film of white and then the very loose egg yolk, and you break it and you swirl it all together as if you're going to scramble the eggs and fry them in the pan. Throw a little soy sauce in there and suck it down. You got to try everything at least once. The coffee was really, really great. Then we walked across from that building, about a 15-minute walk. We first had to walk through the campus of the Singapore Management University and then the Singapore Law School. The Management University on the left, the law school on the right, and the campus, beautiful greenery and these beautiful buildings. And literally almost everywhere you go in the city, you're going to find this within a block or a half a block away. We then went down what is called Armenian Street. Now, these are not the religious Armenians. These are ethnic Armenians. This is actually named after some Armenians who had lived here at the end of the 19th century, the earliest 20th century and on. This was a market street, an open-air market, very similar to what we're used to when we have what we would call a farmer's market or something. And they've redone the street, and they've updated things and everything. And so we walked down this street because at the very end of it is where the Bible house was located. At 10 o'clock, we were now having a congregational meeting. The night before, we had the opportunity for the elders and deacons to hear and see about whether or not Terrence and Open Kingdom Church Planning Network, whether or not that would work. And then this is the opportunity for the congregation to say, well, what's Terrence's vision and how does it work? And so here's a brief summary of his vision. So he began by pointing out that if you look at this ellipse, there are more people living inside the ellipse than in the rest of the world. This is a NASA map where they gave you a picture of light density in the night sky combined with population density. So this region of the world, from India all the way over to China, Japan, the Koreans, literally it's glowing orange-red because there's so many people there and they're so built up with all the light. And so if you look there, you can barely see some of the green on Malaysia, and you see one of the Indonesian islands at the very bottom of the circle that's bright orange. Just slightly above that is where Singapore. It's right into center of the South Pacific area where there are very, very few solid churches. Terrence's vision is to plant, root, and grow the Reformed Presbyterian Church in what he calls the Asia Pacific. Here's a rough dateline. Don't hold him to these dates. 2020, ordain and install Terrence, and then relaunch Providence Reformed Presbyterian. 2025, work on a church plant or plants, partnering with One Covenant Church. And then in 2030, have enough, at least 3, to reform the Reformed Presbytery of Singapore. And then by 2040, working with other Reformed Presbyterian churches in Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, others, form the Asia Pacific Reformed Seminary. So what role does the Church of Chantilly play in this? Well, remember, we're a part of the Open Kingdom Church Planting Network. And so working with the Open Kingdom Church Planting Network, we're going to be helping Providence Reformed Presbyterian Church, One Covenant Church, and then a new church plant. We'll be helping them. Some of the things we'll be doing is significantly, they don't have a credible seminary over there. So working with Birmingham Theological Seminary, which has got some really good up-to-date distance learning and the possibility of having teachers travel over there to do some intensive week or 2-week courses for them. We have some opportunities to really help train their members, their officers, their future pastors. So this is all very, very exciting. Beyond that, remember, Presbyterianism is new to them. How do we do this? What do we do when we get in this situation? How do we handle? Well, we will provide a ready resource for advice and counsel on how to do these things. This is the purpose of the Open Kingdom Church Planting Network. A church is sharing whatever resources they have available to help plant other churches that have a vision to reach the communities around them. An Acts 1:8 vision. If you've got different ethnicities around you, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the othermost parts, then reach those. And then if you have someone who'd like to go and travel and reach an unreached people in the othermost parts or a underreached people, say in Singapore, you pray and you ask God to provide the resources, and then you put your faith to action. So that's how we as a congregation can be participating in helping this congregation. I got to tell you, as we went through the weekend, I was very encouraged to see their responses to what we were proposing and how we might help. But it got real busy. We had some lunch with them, and believe it or not, we got back to the hotel room by 3:30. And Terrence said, yeah, Reed, go ahead and go upstairs, take a nap. So I went upstairs and took a nap and woke up at 12:30 in the morning. Terrence was kind, didn't wake me up. But again, my clock is still back in Montgomery. It's like noon to me in the middle of the night. So I'm up. And finally, we decide to get rolling at 8 a.m. We walk across the street to that building where the multiple vendors were. The Food Republic is what it's called. They each have their own little kiosks and then share an air-conditioned cafeteria-style location. I got a delicious cup of coffee and 2 of these sweet rolls. They're very interesting, flaky sweet rolls, and I really forget what they were called, but they were very, very good, very light, enjoyable. Enjoyed breakfast. Then we got picked up by the taxi, decided we weren't going to sweat this time instead of walking over to the church, and we managed to get to the church, and at 10 a.m. we had a worship service. A very traditional Presbyterian worship service. It was very encouraging. We sang out of the Trinity hymnal, for example, and Terrence brought the message. It was very encouraging to people. And then we went back to check out of our hotel, change our clothes, and get ready. And at 1 o'clock, we all met over at Elder Ho's apartment. This congregation is very, very interesting. God has blessed this congregation to have a lot of people in it who are very involved in the life of Singapore. Elder Ho, for example, was one of the directors of the Botanical Gardens until he retired recently. And so in his retirement, part-time, he goes over a couple of days a week to dig in the dirt over the Botanical Garden just because he loves it. The other elders, they all have different positions. One of them is in charge of the teacher training, certifying all their teacher colleges and things like that for the whole nation. And so very interesting people. And then they've got very run-of-the-mill people, teachers and factory workers. And it was a very healthy congregation, about the same size as ours, about 50 people. And I just want to encourage you. You can see there down on the right, there is one Anglo as a part of the congregation. Most of them are Chinese. There's a few Malay in there. They have some Indians as well. And they were just so grateful and so appreciative that Orlando Korean PCA and the church at Chantilly, Open Kingdom Church Planting Network, would send 2 pastors to help them look at getting a pastor from their own country who would be able to stay for the rest of his life. That kind of commitment from us, and then the willingness to continue to help and help them with advice and counsel and everything, and resources in terms of the education and everything, they just couldn't believe it. They literally were like, what is so special about us that you would come and do this? What's so special about us that your congregations would give you the time to come and see us? And the answer was, well, you know the answer. You're good Presbyterians. There's nothing special about you or us. There's something special about Jesus. So it was terribly, terribly encouraging, guys. Well, we got done that, and we needed to get over to the airport, and so we went over a little early, and we went in, and it got there about 3:30, and we hung around and talked to some more of the members for a little while, enjoyed some more coffee, and checked in and got through security at about 6 or so, and then had to get something to eat. And so I asked, and Jay and Terrence were kind. We went to a Leary Sports Bar where I ordered myself a good old greasy cheeseburger. Ate, relaxed, took a little nap, and at about 9:30, we took off and headed back over the Atlantic. That's right, there's the same picture. It's just reversed on you. Watched some more dumb movies. It was on the way back, it was a lot harder. I already saw all the really good ones. And then at about 12 o'clock in Atlanta, Addie picked me up. We headed back home to Montgomery. It was simply a wonderful time. It was a great trip. Again, I can't thank you enough for being able to let me leave. I'm so grateful that you let Pastor Vince and Jeff preach for you that Sunday, and so grateful for them. Thank you, men. And I just wanted to think about this for a second. So Terrence is going back to his home country. An Open Kingdom Church Planting Network and the Church of Chantilly are going to be helping him set up the Singapore Reformed Presbytery, and then, as God blesses, the Reformed Presbytery Synod of the Asia Pacific. That's simply just stunning to me, guys. Halfway around the world. Some years ago, one of our elders heard about Briarwood's desire to be an epicenter church, to have ministries that God used to help other churches around the world. And that elder looked at me and said, "That's the kind of vision we need." And my response at the time was, "Are you nuts?" And apparently he was. But apparently God smiled and said, "Yes, that's the kind of vision I want you guys to have." The Church of Chantilly is becoming an epicenter church. Oh, I know we're still weak in many ways, and we're still small in many ways. But we've got some very healthy worship going on, some credible discipleship occurring, and some great opportunities for witnessing developing. We really can be used of God to help the Lion Jesus Christ take over the Lion City and then the whole South Pacific. So again, I want to thank you for your kindness and your time. It is terribly great to be a pastor who can say, my congregation's healthy. They can afford to let me leave and take this trip for a short period of time and then come back. You guys are great. I look forward to serving you for many, many more years, us growing together and seeing God use us in this amazing way and in other amazing ways yet to come. Again, thank you. Love you guys. Bye-bye.